picture and then send it back to them. This is for my daughter, Libby, who's 8. Would you be willing to be in a picture with Flat Stanley so I can send it back to the United States for her? Would you do that for me? Yes? If you're shy, hide your eyes, okay? Would you be willing to take a picture of Flat Stanley and I? With the crowd, yes. Yes? Very good. It's very important to be competitive. Libby is but there will be lots of software being written. So it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. My name is Scott Davis. We're going to be talking about the mean stack today, which is a wonderful acronym because it's not a mean stack at all. It's a very nice, friendly stack. But of course, mean is short for Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node.js. So this will be a nice survey of 4 various technologies. As I said, my name is Scott Davis. I run a company called ThirstyHead. By the way, I neglected to mention this during my keynote. All of these slides are available to you at my.thirstyhead.com. If you go to www, that's just kind of a brochureware website. But if you go to my.thirstyhead.com, you'll get an opportunity to have these slides, as well as the slides for my keynote, as well as the rest of the presentations I'll be doing today. And I'll be rolling up slides that I'm giving tomorrow and on Friday as well. So my.thirstyhead.com is where you can follow along. So I've been doing web development for almost 20 years now, and I can say that. The first popular web browsers were coming out in 1995, 1996. And I've been doing a lot of web development, and if you've been in the industry for a while, you remember the various technologies you've used. You remember doing Perl-based websites, I'm sure. I wrote ASP-based web pages, active server page web pages. I remember one of my clients, I had to convince them that they should trust this new technology called JSP, Java Server Pages. I said, I know it's just 0.9.2, but trust me, this is going to be the future of web development in Java. And it was, wasn't it? Struts, J2EE, it was when it was J2EE, JEE, Groovy, Grails, and now Node.js. And as I said this morning in my keynote, the syntax has changed across all those, but the basic concepts remain the same. So even though I'm showing you a number of specific implementations today that really represent kind of the cutting edge or the modern way to do web development, certainly these technologies can be used independently, and you can learn a lot from them even if you're not using any of these particular technologies. But let's begin with a little quiz. What am I showing you here? What does that set of icons represent? LAMP, exactly. So the LAMP stack, you've heard of that, right? Yeah? LAMP is short for Linux, Apache for your web server, MySQL for your database, and then the P could be Perl or PHP or Python or any number of things like that. So the LAMP stack, none of those technologies were expressly written to work together. But what we found is that integrating them together gave you a very quick way to assemble a large set of disparate technologies and allow you to get started and get working. So the LAMP stack you knew. Now, are you familiar with the WIMP stack? Well, let's think about this. If you replace Linux with Windows, and you replace Apache with IIS, you now have the WIMP stack, don't you? Yeah, Windows, IIS, Microsoft SQL. Yeah, exactly. Now, that's just being mean, isn't it? I didn't write that. It's on Wikipedia, so it must be true. Yeah? No, but there are lots of different ways for us to build up these stacks. The LAMP stack, the WIMP stack, and now, of course, we have the mean stack. Now, this example I'm showing you right up here, mean.io, it's really nice. It's not this company, Linovate, invented any of these technologies or even were the first ones to assemble them. They just put together a really cool website with nice graphics. So if you want to use Linovate's stack, you can go to mean.io and you can either download a zip file or download a tarball or even clone their Git repository, Git clone the mean.io stack. What's interesting is this space is constantly moving and constantly evolving. I put together this presentation in February, and since then, the lead developer on the mean.io stack has left the project and has now created his own website called mean.js.org. So if you come to my workshop on Friday, we're going to be focusing on the mean.js way of accomplishing this. But this slide deck is less than 45 days old, and when I was writing at the time, mean.io was kind of my preferred stack of choice. So it's really nice that there are a lot of different folks out there, a lot of different organizations that are trying to make it easy for you to put these 4 different technologies together. The mean.io is not a bad place to start, but mean.js.org is my new favorite. But as I said, what's nice about this website is they put together a lot of graphics, some nice documentation, some tutorials about what you're dealing with. Now, when it comes to MongoDB, that's an M, but it's actually very different than MySQL. I'm not here hating databases by any stretch of the imagination. I love telling people that relational databases are good for what relational databases are good for. How's that for circular logic, huh? No, if your data naturally lays itself out in a very columnar fashion, a very row-oriented fashion, there is nothing wrong with a relational database. It's very mature technology, but sometimes you're dealing with data that doesn't lay itself out nicely. Think of email as an example. You might say, well, the subject line, let's limit the subject line to 255 characters, so we'll create a varchar 255 column in Oracle, and that's sufficient for the subject line. How big do you want to make your body? Well, it's really unlimited, isn't it? So you could set up a blob or a clob if you wanted to, and all right, but then we really can't query it or index it or anything. That's fine. How are you going to deal with attachments, binary attachments? Oh boy, do you want to really start putting binary objects in your database? Email is a great example of something that lends itself very nicely to a document-oriented persistence solution like MongoDB. But Mongo isn't the only NoSQL database out there. It's one of the most popular now because people are putting nice, pretty graphics around it as well. But there's also CouchDB, and if you don't want CouchDB, there's Redis, and if you don't want Redis, there's Cassandra, and if you don't want Cassandra, there's, right? So there are many different solutions out there. So when I'm talking about Mongo, I'm talking about both a specific implementation, but more so a general idea that sometimes a NoSQL solution would lend itself very nicely to what you're trying to solve. I was doing a lot of work at Time Warner Cable. We were dealing with their smart TV. So you could pull your Samsung TV out of the box, hang it on the wall, and immediately start watching Time Warner Cable programming. You didn't have to have a cable plugged into the back of it or a cable box. It was all through over the air. It was all through Wi-Fi and their local network. And we found that a NoSQL solution lent itself very nicely to movie descriptions and TV descriptions and things that were of variable lengths. Some had fields, others didn't have fields, and so we had a more flexible, persistent solution. Express is the de facto web framework right now if you're doing Node.js development. Much like in the 1990s, if you were a Java developer, you were probably using struts. Nowadays, I have to say this because Josh is sitting in the front row here, you're most likely using Spring. Spring MVC, something like that. That is kind of the de facto standard now for Java-based web development. And so Spring is to Java as Express is to Node. It's not the only framework out there, but it's wildly popular. So now we have a NoSQL database, we have a web framework, but the Express framework, interestingly enough, is for server-side MVC. What a lot of the cool kids are doing these days are client-side MVC, model view controller-based frameworks. And there are a whole host of different options out there. At Time Warner Cable, we were using Backbone. Because you know, every smart TV that you buy, whether it's Samsung or LG or Panasonic or Sony, it comes with a web browser baked into it at this point. And it's most likely a WebKit browser as well. The same browser you're using in Safari and Chrome and iPhones and Android devices. It's the same browser. So when we were building our app, we were using Backbone.js as our client, and it was running directly on the Samsung TV. And we were using Mongo behind the scenes to serve up the data to it. But as we know, Backbone is a client-side MVC framework. Angular.js is a client-side MVC framework. Knockout is a client-side framework. Ember is a client-side framework. There are lots of different client-side frameworks. So once again, I think you're beginning to see a pattern form here that even though I'm going to be talking specifically about Mongo and Express and Angular, for work my company did for the Colorado Department of Roads, CDOT, Department of Transportation, we used CouchDB and Express and jQuery Mobile. It was still very much this same stack, just used different implementations. At Time Warner Cable, we were using Backbone and Mongo. So you begin seeing patterns forming here. Angular is a very, very popular client-side MVC framework. It's got a much a less steep learning curve than something like Backbone or something along those lines. So it's a very friendly, easy, good first opportunity for you to begin experiencing client-side model view controller frameworks. And then there's Node.js. So we're going to talk about each one of these things as we go along. Before I knew what I was talking about, that happens to me a lot. It didn't stop me from talking, I just didn't know what I was talking about. But when I started with Node, I was like, oh, so Node is like a web server, right? Node is the Apache of this, or the IIS, or the Tomcat, or the JBoss. And in fact, what I discovered is Node is not a web server. Node is a JavaScript runtime. It's much closer to a JVM, a Java Virtual Machine, than a Tomcat or a JBoss or something running on top of it. So it's really interesting that Node is JavaScript that you can just coincidentally run your web server on top of. But when you look at your web server and your client-side framework and your server-side framework and your NoSQL persistence store, you begin seeing why people are so excited about this mean stack. It really is a nice representation of how many people are doing modern 21st century web development. Does that make sense? Yeah? Excellent. All right. So let's dive in then and take a look at each one of these pieces individually. So we could install Node, and then install Express, and then install MongoDB, and then install Mongoose the driver, and then install Angular, and then install Twitter Bootstrap, and then install jQuery, and then, yeah. But what we're really looking for is someone that's already done all that integration work for us. And that is what the Mean.io project was. It was the opportunity for you to turn around and install it just by cloning that Mean.io framework. And there's nothing wrong with that. And again, that's what we're going to do in here to begin with. But I mentioned something in my keynote that I'm a big fan of these days. I'm a huge fan of Yeoman. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be giving a presentation on Yeoman, the very last slot today. Yeoman is a command line tool that makes it very easy for you to scaffold out various things. And what's interesting is when I'm using Grails, I'm using the Grails set of commands, the commands that came with Grails, the web framework. If I were using Rails, I would be using the Rails set of commands. Josh's really excited to show me Spring Boot. I'm assuming that Spring Boot has a very rich command line interface, a rich set of commands that I can use to incorporate various things along with it. What's different about Yeoman is that it is a framework for building these command line interfaces. So Yeoman has this idea of generators, and there are well over 400 different generators out there. So once you install Yeoman, you can install a backbone generator, and it'll make it easy for you to scaffold out new backbone apps. If you install the Ember generator, it'll make it easy to deal with Ember apps. If you install the Angular generator, it will do those kinds of things. So Yeoman is really a springboard for a variety of different projects, making it easy to do this kind of command line scaffolding. Yeoman, in fact, is really 3 separate projects that they have brought together. So it's kind of funny that I'm talking to you about Yeoman, which is 3 different stacks that are going to make it easy to put together the mean stack, which are 4 different projects. Have you read the book Small Pieces Loosely Joined? Have you heard that title before? That's web development in a nutshell, isn't it? All we're doing now is finding different libraries out there and integrating them together. So my integration library, not the least bit ironically, is a combination of several command line tools as well. So Yo scaffolds out our new application. Grunt is a command line build tool. Grunt is to JavaScript as Ant or Maven is to Java, as Gradle is to Groovy, as Rake is to Ruby. You get the idea, right? Every programming language has a build tool. There are a number of different build tools out there. There's Grunt, there's Gulp, there's Volt, there are a variety of different ones out there. But Grunt seems to be one of the most popular ones out there. So Grunt is going to be your build scripts. It's how you're going to compile your code. It's going to how you launch your server. It's going to how you concatenate and minify and uglify and do all these kinds of various things like that. So Grunt has a number of plugins as well that make it easier to do those kinds of things. Bower is the third piece of the puzzle. Makes it very easy for you to install client-side JavaScript libraries. So you'll see us do a Bower install jQuery, and it'll install jQuery into your app, or Bower install underscore, or Bower install backbone, or Bower install various things like that. It's a way of taking third-party libraries and incorporating that into your project. So Yeoman, if you have a command line utility that allows you to scaffold things out, in combination with a build script that is pluggable as well, in combination with something that makes it easy for you to pull in third-party dependencies, you've got a pretty rich suite of tools. So, along those lines, there are a number of different mean generators out there. I mean, there are half a dozen of them out there. So, the reason why I have moved my alliance in 45 short days from mean.io to mean.js is in no small part because of this generator. And this generator was just released at the beginning of this month, the beginning of April. So this is very, very new stuff. But what I would do is I would install Yo if I didn't have it already, and then I would install this mean.js generator, and then I would type in Yo mean.js to start my application. So you begin seeing what I'm angling for right here. And so if you want to get more on mean.js, come back and join me on Friday when we're doing these half-day tutorials, and we'll get a chance to work on that hands-on. But in the meantime, let's swing through and begin talking about each piece of the puzzle, not in order. They call it the mean stack, Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. But what you're going to learn today is technically the NEMA stack, I guess, at least in the order I'm going to be teaching it to you. We're going to start with Node, and then go to Eclipse, and then go to Mongo, and then wrap up with with Angular. So you can call it the NEMA stack. No one will know what you're talking about. But they'll know you've been in my talk. It is the mean stack, but we're just changing the order of the letters a little bit. So to begin with, let's talk about Node. As I said, Node is not a web server. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions out there. Node is a JavaScript runtime. It is quite literally the V8 engine. Patrick mentioned that in his previous talk, that the V8 JavaScript engine that is running inside of Chrome is the same JavaScript engine that Node is using. When I say it's a headless JavaScript engine, does that make sense? It means they've literally pulled the JavaScript engine out of your browser and allowed you to run it standalone with outside of the browser. It's generally recognized as one of the fastest JavaScript runtime environments. So Node.js is really just V8. V8 is written by Google. But what's really interesting, Lars, the architect of the V8 JavaScript engine, you know what he did before he moved to Google and did that? He was working for Sun and Oracle as the JVM architect. So he has had a long history of building runtime environments. If you are a Java developer, you're using his work. And if you are a web developer, you're using his work as well. Just a brief side note, if you can run the JavaScript engine headless, it probably goes to reason that you could run the HTML render kit headless as well. That's what the Phantom.js project is. So if you think about it, a modern browser is really made up of three key components: a JavaScript runtime, an HTML render kit, and a plugin infrastructure. Now the plugins are falling out of favor. That seems to be where the zero-day exploits usually are. How many times have you had to patch your Flash plugin, or patch your Java plugin, or patch your whatever plugin to deal with those things? So this plugin-based work is really falling out of favor. And so really a browser is made up of a render kit and a JavaScript engine. And if Node is the V8 engine being run headless, Phantom.js is the render kit being headless. If you have a continuous integration server, you can run all of your unit tests in Jenkins, in Hudson, in Bamboo, in whatever continuous integration framework you're using, and you can run it in Phantom.js. By headless, it means you won't be able to visualize it, but what it will do for you is it'll render those pages out as PDFs, or it'll render them out as SVG. So if you really do want to see what that browser kit is doing, it's a one-liner to render that out. Yeah? So Node.js, though, is what we're talking about. And what's interesting about Node is, yes, it's Chrome's runtime, but it's also interesting all the different places it's being used. Big names are using this. Microsoft is using this. Yahoo is using this. eBay is using this. There are a variety of different companies. Walmart is using it. Time Warner Cable is using it. My company, ThirstyHead, is using it. If you go to thirstyhead.com or my.thirstyhead.com, you're seeing the mean stack in action. It's an incredibly fast, robust, surprisingly mature runtime environment. If you think about it, JavaScript has been around for over 20 years. So it's got a lot of history. It's just as old as the Java platform and the Ruby platform. But for so many years, we've thought that JavaScript could only be run in a browser. It's just now that we're beginning to realize that you can run JavaScript outside of the browser to great effect. And if you're a Java developer, how many of you are Java developers, by the way? Yeah, many of you. Did you know that since Java 6, you've had a JavaScript runtime that shipped with the JDK? It was not Google's JavaScript runtime. It's actually Mozilla's or Firefox. It's called Rhino. So Rhino is Firefox's JavaScript engine that ships standard with the JDK. If you've upgraded to Java 8, and I certainly hope you are, there's lots of good stuff in Java 8, but one of the biggest changes is they upgraded Rhino to a project called Nashorn. And do you know what Nashorn means? It's German for Rhino. Yeah. So Nashorn is a very fast, modern, very fast JavaScript runtime that runs just about as fast as V8. So as Java developers, you can start running JavaScript outside of the browser as well with Nashorn or Rhino. Yeah. Now, you can install it in a variety of different ways. And it really is a first-class citizen across all these different platforms. It started with a very Linux and OS 10 Macintosh kind of strong focus. But Microsoft is a core contributor, and they are very insistent on making Node.js a first-class citizen on the Windows platform as well. So you should have no worries at all about downloading the appropriate installer for any one of these platforms and getting it running. Are you ever worried about running Java on a variety of different platforms? You ever worried about running Java on Windows or Java on Linux or things? Yeah, you should treat Node the same way. It runs equally well across all platforms. Yeah. But wait! That's great if you just want to install it once. But on an ongoing basis, I've found that using a little project called NVM, the Node Version Manager, is incredibly helpful. Because now from the command line, I can list out all the different versions of Node that I have installed on my system. I can also NVM list all the remote versions that are available to me right there. And we can see that I'm running 10.2.5. They've upgraded 10.2.6 on me. If I wanted to upgrade, all I'd have to do is say NVM install 10.2.6, and it would be there. But all of these versions, all of those kinds of blue or purple versions are available. So I can say NVM use 0.10.23 or NVM use.25 or NVM use 26 and bounce among those different versions. It's incredibly helpful for me as a consultant because as I move from client to client, I very quickly need to change versions. Now, I know we're here talking about Node, but there's also a project called GVM that is for Groovy and Grails and things like that. So if I do a GVM list, we'll begin seeing, come on, I'm sorry, how about this? GVM list Grails. I can turn around and use this in much the same way. I've got one client that is using 2.0.4, so I have that installed on my system. I've got another client that's using 2.3.7. So it makes it very easy for me to say GVM use Grails 2.04. GVM use Groovy this version. NVM use this version kind of things. So these kinds of utilities are incredibly helpful, especially if you want to experiment with different versions. So some more details here. Like I said, we can install it, we can use it, we can even alias it up and set defaults. So every new shell that you open will always use those various things. Remember, these slides are available to you at my.thirstyhead.com. So getting Node installed should not be a tough project. Double-click an installer and answer all the questions, or NVM install Node. You've got many different ways to get Node on your system. And once you have Node installed, then the fun can begin. The reason why so many people think Node is a web server is because right on their homepage, this is their Hello World example. We talked about Hello Worlds and how important they are, but if this is our Node.js homepage right here, you can see that the very first thing they show you, the very first example right here, is they're like, oh look, we can create our own web server in half dozen lines of code. So let me make a Node directory here, let me pull it up, and let me just create a quick file called server.js. I'll make sure it ends up in the right location. Let's see here. GIDS. What? There we go. Oops. Where was I at? Where am I at? I'm lost. All right, we can do this. I thought I was there just a moment ago, but we'll find out. All right. This is our web server now. But you'll see what we're doing is we're requiring in HTTP. Once you require in that library, you have the ability to do things like send down the content type, send down text, listen on a specific port. So if I come back out right now, I don't think I dumped that in the right location at all. All right, let's do this. There we go. Now I know I have the file in the right location right here. If I come in here and then just invoke that file, I can see I now have a web server running at that particular port. And if I come over here right now and see what I have to look at, I can see there's my hello world. Coming back once again, if I pull up that server and I say instead of hello world, if I say hello GIDS. Oops, let me bounce my server real quick. There it is. There's hello GIDS. So the point of this exercise is not that Node is a web server, is that it's incredibly easy to make it be a web server. And half dozen lines of code are next. Less. But what's really interesting about this is I've spent most of my career deploying my apps to a web server. When I was doing old Perl CGI work, I had to copy my files into the Apache directory. When I was doing Java development, I had to copy my jars and wars into the Tomcat directory or the JBoss. This is kind of an inversion of control, not that kind of IOC. This is just the opposite way of thinking of things. Instead of me having to go to the server, what I'm doing is I am incorporating the server into my app. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting because what it means then is it's a breeze to deploy this app in a variety of different places. All I basically have to have is Node.js, and you'll see in just a moment I can even specify a particular version of Node.js to make sure that I have all the libraries I'm looking for. But I deploy that app to Node.js, and then Node.js pulls in the web dependencies as necessary. So this is Node.js. When we're talking about dependencies, Node ships with something called NPM, the Node Package Manager, that makes it incredibly easy for us to install different libraries. I could NPM install Express. I could NPM install Mongoose, my MongoDB driver. I can NPM install Angular. I can NPM install all of these different libraries. So it makes it very easy for me to turn around and bring in dependencies. There are over 60,000 Node modules out there. So it's an incredibly diverse and robust and active community building these things. So, when it comes to installing MeanIO, we could say a git clone, bring in that. And then we'll see there are a number of different files that ship standard with that. So let's walk through these. The most important one that we're going to be looking at is package.json. This is standard not only in Node.js, but it's a standard that has worked its way into the client-side library community as well. Package.json is just a really nice, friendly way to define all of your dependencies. So here is what our package.json looks like. You can see it's got some nice metadata like a name and a description and a version and who wrote it and the repository it came from. But here's where it gets really interesting. This is where I determine what version of Node I need to run on. So you can see by saying o.10.x, it's saying, yeah, I need a more recent version of NPM. You'll see in addition to dealing with the engines you're dealing with, you can specify some start scripts, npm start, npm test, npm post install. We're going to talk about Bower in just a moment, but what's really interesting is after I type in npm install to install all my server-side dependencies, it will kick off a Bower install to install all my client-side dependencies. But here are all my dependencies: Express, Jade, Mongoose, so on and so forth in here. And you can see now that this isn't just a jar in a WebInf lib directory somewhere. This is a named jar with a particular version next to it. So if I checked out this project, the first thing I would do is type in npm install. It would look in package.json and pull in all my dependencies. All of my runtime dependencies that are in the dependencies package and all my development dependencies to make sure that I've got Grunt installed, Karma for unit testing, should for my assertions, supertest, things like that. This package.json is really wonderful because it makes everything very explicit. I can check out the project, take a look at package.json, and know exactly what its dependency graph is. Yeah? Some other things we can do in addition to package. I told you that package.json was for your server-side dependencies. Bower.json is for your client-side dependencies. So I can come in here right now and see that I rely on Angular. I rely on Twitter Bootstrap. I rely on jQuery. I rely on a bunch of different things. One of the things you might notice is that jQuery isn't explicitly mentioned in here because both package.json and Bower do transitive dependencies. And so if I include Twitter Bootstrap, and Bootstrap in its Bower.json file said I depend on jQuery, when I install Bootstrap, I get jQuery for free. If I did a Bower install Backbone, I would get underscore and jQuery for free. So even though that list might look short, you have to realize that the transitive dependency graph is traveled all the way down. All right. So I would do an npm install, and once all the server-side dependencies are there, it would kick off a Bower install and give me all my client-side dependencies. So now I'm ready to rock and roll. I can do an npm start, and I can fire up my app. So I want you to remember what we've done. I haven't typed in these commands, but the commands I would type in would have been, and let's move up here. The commands I would have typed in is I would have typed in git clone to get this. I would have typed in npm install, and now I can type in npm start, and I've got my app up and running on port 3000. So let's move briefly through the rest of this. So this package not only gives you the typical logins that you would need, it gives you hooks so you can begin doing OAuth logins against Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or GitHub or a variety of things like that. So that's all handled through a package called Passport that comes along. You'd be able to begin creating new articles and do the basic CRUD. So now we've got a shell of an app up and running. All we did was an installed node and then use the node package manager in Bower to pull in all our dependencies. So now, what are those dependencies giving us? You saw me create a server.js file for my simple little half-dozen line hello world. You should begin seeing a pattern forming here that server.js is very important. So let me come in here and take a look at my server.js. And instead of requiring an HTTP like we did, we required Express. We require FS for the file hub, Twitter, Facebook authentication. So we begin seeing that the first thing that our server.js tells us is we need Express. All right, let's talk about what Express is. It's a web application framework for Node. Wonderful. I'm a Grails guy by trade, and so I'm used to saying Grails create app and scaffold out a whole bunch of stuff. All right, that's great. That's what Linux did for me. So I'm now ready to start creating models, right? And then I read the FAQ. I was like, how do I define models? Well, Express doesn't really care what model you're going to use. And it's an MVC framework. Yeah, but you just kind of create your own models. So, okay. I guess it's nice and flexible. Well, how do I deal with authentication? Express doesn't really care how you authenticate. All right, I guess I can plug in something like that. What template engine would you like me to use? I don't really care what templates you use. As a matter of fact, there are over 100 out there that I could use. There's a library out there called Consolidate that is expressly made to use all these different templating libraries and bind them to Express. Have you ever walked into a restaurant for breakfast and you're very tired and you said, I need a cup of coffee, please. It's an emergency. And they said, would you like coffee or espresso or cappuccino or lattes? Or just coffee. This is an emergency. I'm very hungover. I need coffee. Yeah? And they say, would you like cream? No, I just need coffee. Would you like sugar? No, I just need coffee. Would you like, I need coffee, right? That's kind of my experience with Express. Great, where's my model? You can use whatever model you want. What about authentication? Oh, use whatever authentication you want. Templates? Oh, we don't care. You know what pushed me over the edge? Will you at least give me a directory structure? No, you can use whatever directory structure you want. What? What are you bringing to the party then, Express? Actually, I'm having fun at Express's extent. You've got to realize that Express in its entirety is less than 1,000 lines of code. So it's really not a full stack framework. Really what it is a universal adapter that allows me to bring in these various frameworks, which is why Express is so wildly popular, is that it is the glue code that almost everyone is using to build up their stack. So in Express's defense, its flexibility is its strength, not its heavy opinions. So, if we go looking at Server.js now and we see Express, we begin seeing that one of the first things it does is it's dealing with our various routes. That is what Express does for you more than anything else. Every URL you type in, it needs to point you to a particular route. So knowing that, and knowing that index is the entry point for any web app, I ought to be able to come up here into my app directory, into routes, and find an index.js. So this is the entry point to my app. I can tell that whenever I ask for / that entry point, it is going to call index.render. And what is index? Oh, okay, that's my controller. Now we're getting into MVC, right? Model View Controller. Great. Well, let's take a look now at my controller and see what that controller does. Okay, nice. It's going to be rendering my view, and it's going to pass in things like a user and various things like that. So I started at my route. I went to a controller. If I go looking at my views now, here is my index.js, and that's where that user is getting picked up that I passed in. So what's very nice about this is being able to determine what's going on just based on following a route, which leads you to a controller, which leads you to a view. There's your model view controller that you're looking for. Now, these layouts are where we begin seeing our nav bars come in, our Twitter Bootstrap, various things like that. Here's our header content. There's our footer content. We've got all of these kind of partials that we're really beginning to pull together. But remember, Express is your server-side MVC, handling routes on the server. It's going to get a request, which is going to be registered with a route that's going to create a controller, that's going to create a view, that's going to bring together a bunch of templates and eventually assemble HTML as we go down. So if we went looking at the articles route, this is a more full-fledged route, something that's going to begin pulling data out of a database. You see where we're going next, right? There's going to be another player here in just a moment. Yeah. But these articles right here are our routes. When I do an HTTP GET to this pattern, that's the method that's going to invoke it. When I do an HTTP POST to that URI, that's what's going to get invoked. When I do a PUT, that's what's going to get invoked, or a delete. So you begin seeing these routes can be far more sophisticated than simple HTTP GETs. But when I go looking at, say, the GET method, and I see my model show up in Mongoose, I say, oh, it's time to add a new letter now, isn't it? We now know what Node is, our platform and our web server, Express being our server-side framework to basically handle routes, as well as controllers and views and good things like that. Now we can talk about MongoDB and Mongoose as well. So MongoDB, short for humongous, because it's meant for very big web data, things like that. So MongoDB is out there. It's equally well supported on all platforms. You can download it, get it installed, up and running. You literally don't have to do any configuration at all. You could download Mongo and start it up, and when you start up your app, it'll automatically look for a local instance of Mongo running, and it'll create its own databases as necessary. So there's nothing you have to do other than having Mongo installed and up and running, and it'll attach itself appropriately. But Mongoose is the Mongo driver for Node.js. And more than that, Mongoose is your ORM. So GORM, the Grails object relational mapper, GORM is to Grails as Mongoose is to Node.js. So Mongoose allows us to go in and do that kind of stuff that I was expecting Express to allow me to do. Notice we're going to require in Mongoose, just like we required in Express or required in HTTP, we're going to require in that driver, and then it's going to connect up to that localhost driver. It's going to allow us to create a new model called cat, and then new up a cat, kitty, and then save it or delete it or update it or various things like that. So Mongoose is giving us our ORM, our object relational mapping, except it's not really relational. I guess it would have to be an ORN, an ONM, right? An object NoSQL mapper. But Mongo brings a lot of fun things to us. It allows us to create an article that has a created field of this type and set up some defaults, a title field, a content field, a user field. It allows us to define those things that you'd expect to do in a model. It allows us to put in validations. We need to make sure the title has a length. We need to make sure that we've got things to load, various things like that. Mongoose is what you're going to use for all of your model or data needs. Yeah. And then finally, we get to Angular. We're now in the A of NEMA. And so Angular is our client-side MVC framework. Written by Google, very fast, very well written, very easy to get started with. What's nice about Angular, they say it's HTML enhanced for web apps. Many of the client-side MVC frameworks out there are very JavaScript-centric. Backbone expects you to be an expert JavaScript developer. Knockout and Ember use deep kind of JavaScript patterns and designs that assume that you know all the subtle nuances of JavaScript. Angular takes a very HTML-centric approach, and that's why I think it's had a nice big uptake. It's an easier way into client-side MVC that doesn't require you to be a JavaScript superstar. So when you see hello worlds like this, where you say, hello, your name, and they use the familiar double curly brace in there. And then notice we have an input type here that is named your name. Literally, this binds to this. So as you're typing in your name right there, it immediately shows that stuff out. You don't have to write a lick of JavaScript to do all that binding, which is what you would have to manually in a JavaScript or Ember or a Knockout. By being HTML-centric, it allows you to use template-type syntax and bind it by name to input fields and various things like that. Now, of course, there is JavaScript if you need to do more sophisticated things like make an AJAX request and bind it. But out of the box, if you're just staying all client-side, it makes it incredibly easy to do that kind of stuff. So what does that look like for us? When it comes time for us to create a form, we'll see that I've got a form up here. Labels for title, labels for content, labels for various things. But notice where it's going on submit, it's going to a create method. So if we go looking for our controller once again, not our server-side controller now, but our client-side controller, we'll see our client-side controller says, hey, when someone calls create, let's new up an article, and then let's save it. And then let's pass it back to that server-side path. So you begin seeing how these pieces are all working together. So articles allow you to say, hey, is this guy authenticated? Is this user allowed to save these kinds of things? So we begin seeing that it's not one monolithic library, it's a number of different, highly cohesive, loosely coupled libraries working in coordination with each other. So then, what we've managed to do here is give you the briefest of brief overviews. You need to take a deep dive into each one of these things. But the good news is success breeds success and confidence. And rather than asking you to manually install all these things and manually integrate, what I'm encouraging you to do is use mean.io. Use meanjs.org. Use a generator. Use one of these things to download a fully working stack. And then walk your way through it. And once you see how those pieces work together, then it's easy enough for you to turn around and extend it and use it on your own. Do you feel better about Mean than you did 60 minutes ago? I do as well. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it.